It's all tied together. It's all tied together. How many of you would agree with this statement? Americans have gotten less reasonable, less rational, less optimistic, and more subject to bad ideas in the last 20 years. Now, the reason why that feels like the case is because we have introduced record levels of financial insecurity into our population. And studies have shown that if you cannot pay your bills, your bandwidth gets constrained cognitively because you're just trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And it has the functional impact of reducing your IQ by 13 points, or 1 standard deviation. So if you have the feeling that our fellow citizens are getting less reasonable, less rational, less optimistic, and more subject to bad ideas, they are. Because that is exactly what you would expect if you can't pay your bills in a country where 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and almost half can't afford an unexpected $400 bill. So what we do is we get the boot off their throat economically. We say, look, you're the citizen of the richest, most advanced economy in the history of the world. Here's a $1,000 dividend for you and your child. And then all of a sudden, they'd become much more reasonable, rational. If you say, hey, climate change is real, they'll be like, oh yeah, I really need to worry about that. Because you can't worry about a problem that seems like it's years away if you can't pay next month's rent. The big move we have to make is we have to start viewing people as having intrinsic value independent of the market. So if the market says, hey, as a coal miner, you used to be worth $45,000 a year, but now the mine closed, now you're worth zero. And then we all say, well, maybe we can train that coal miner to become a coder or something, frankly, quite ridiculous. And the only reason why you would even think that for a moment is if you've been brainwashed to think that economic value and human value are the same things, and that if you've lost your market value, then we have to move heaven and earth to find a new slot for you in the market economy. So that's the big progression we have to make. And as you all know, if you've heard anything about my campaign, you know I want to give every American $1,000 a month starting at age 18. This is the big progression, where if we get the boot off of our throats, then the people who are in these towns that might be fearing for their place in the 21st century economy, if they start seeing that we'll all be able to share the gains through a dividend of $1,000 a month for starters, but then we have to build a new human-centered economy on top of that, then that's a vision that I believe that they're willing to accept and embrace. And I'm not saying this speculatively. I've actually been around the country now for 18 months, and I've worked in these communities for 7 years. So Americans are smart. Like, they see what's going on around us, and then if you pitch them on a vision that includes them, they'll actually listen. Their future becomes clearer to them, because instead of thinking about next week or next month, they're actually thinking about 5-10 years from now, and that their child's future becomes assured, and thus something they have to be more concerned about. Now, part of this is a measurement problem, where we have this GDP measurement that is now leading us off a cliff. GDP's at record highs in this country, also at record highs, stress, drug overdoses, suicides, financial insecurity, and our life expectancy has been declining for the last 3 years in a row. First time in 100 years. Last time it happened was the Spanish flu of 1918. So what we have to do is we have to modernize our measurements so that we're not in this tug of war with the other side where we're going around and we're being presented as the scolds who want you to, use a different straw or something like that. The other thing, and I talked about our economic measurements. So right now we have this GDP measurement that we made up 100 years ago, and it's leading us in the wrong directions. So as your president, I'm just going to go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, 100 years old, kind of out of date. Let's modernize it and include things like our children's health and success, which is tied to climate change. Clean air and clean water, obviously tied to our environment. Our health and life expectancy, tied to climate change. Mental health and freedom from substance abuse. All the things that we care about, we actually make the new measurements of economic progress. And while this sounds almost too good to be true, it's very straightforward. You don't even need Congress for this. You have the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they have their measurements, you say, guess what? New measurement, American scorecard includes these things. And right now, we have 3 measurements for our economic progress if you turn on CNBC and the rest of it. It's GDP, which again is going the opposite direction of life expectancy, so which do you listen to? Stock market prices, which correspond to the fortunes of the top 20% of Americans, and headline unemployment rate, which is grossly misleading because it does not include people that are dropping out of the workforce, or people who are discouraged, or underemployed, or doing gig work. And so these three numbers are giving us a falsely positive impression of how we're doing. If you dig a little bit deeper, you start finding all of the problems. And so as president, I would update our measurements. And this would have a huge effect on us being able to make progress on climate change.
Because you'd suddenly see something different. Right now you have the president coming out and touting unemployment numbers,
Yep.
Stock market performance, and GDP. So if a Martian showed up and said, oh, these are your measurements, you're doing very, very well. You're saying change how we look at how we are doing as a society and an economy, and suddenly we'll get a different reading and we'll say, we're in trouble?
Yeah, exactly. Where right now, if you were to have pipes that are poisoning kids, that actually shows up positively in GDP, because then you have to spend money on demolishing the pipes and making new
Hurricanes
ones.
show up positively in GDP.
Hurricane shows up positively in GDP.
Because you're rebuilding everything.
No. So think about how messed up that is. It's like, oh, GDP went up. Well, why? Because we had to rebuild the town? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You should actually have measurements that have hurricanes as very, very bad, have poisoning kids as extraordinarily disastrous, to the point where then it actually pays for you to make sure you have clean water. I mean, what's more expensive? New pipes or poisoning our kids?
Right. We don't measure poisoning our kids.
But we don't measure poisoning our kids.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm known more for being concerned about automation of jobs, artificial intelligence, technology, is that I do think that they're very, very much tied together. To me, 1A is climate change, and then 1B is economic inequities that are turning us against each other, that are about to accelerate and take off. That we're not going to be a country that can counteract climate change if we're rioting because robot trucks took our jobs. I mean, like, we have to address the problems that will actually help energize solutions for climate change and other massive problems. And right now we're polarized, we're divided, we have this dysfunctional government. It's a massive challenge for us to move our country forward in a way that we can all agree upon by the facts. Because at this point, we don't even agree on basic facts. Part of this is the media silos we operate in. Part of it is the institutional mistrust that is built up. Where I think right now Congress has a national approval rating of 12% or something along those lines. And you could say, well, maybe they've earned that. But if you're an American in another part of the country, and then I say, hey, I represent the government, you're like, yeah, the government is full of it. And if I say, hey, the government is proposing something like climate change and science and whatnot, then they mistrust it. Now, one of the things that helps reconstitute trust is when you have a lower stress level, when you actually feel like, and we've seen this in the studies when people have frankly received universal basic income, is that their actual trust in each other goes up. What's beating us right now is this mindset of scarcity that, in my opinion, is also fueling skepticism in science. If you replace that with a mindset of abundance and possibility, which you can't do entirely, but you can certainly reverse the dominance of scarcity and make it more balanced, then you can increase people's acceptance of science. We need to instill a mindset of abundance in this country in order to solve the big problems. And right now it's slipping away. Scarcity is winning in this country by the numbers.